Welcome, life groups, to week 3 of our Awaken Passion and Practice series. If you are new in a life group, you signed up this past weekend or a few weekends ago, whenever you're watching this, welcome. We're so glad that you are part of this really vital ministry of our church. This weekend, we're looking at practice. What does it mean to practice a faith? What are the habits and actions of those who follow Jesus? You love, you gather, you practice, and you go. So what is this whole idea of practice all about? Probably the idea of going on mission is an accessible one if you've been following Jesus. The idea of loving God and your neighbor as yourself, probably also accessible. The idea of community is accessible, but this practice one might be a little bit different for you. So I think let me explain it a little bit. There was a situation, actually was made into a movie on January 15th, 2009. Captain Sullenberger landed U.S. Flight Airways Flight 1549 on the Hudson River. After a bird strike, both engines lost power, and he had to make this emergency landing. So it was really amazing that all 155 people on board survived this harrowing experience. So at the end, when he was interviewed of this, he said, one way of looking at this might be that for 42 years, I've been making small, regular deposits in this bank of experience, education, and training. And on January 15th, the balance was sufficient so that I could make a very large withdrawal. You see, Captain Sullenberger had logged 40 years of experience and 20 hours of flying experience, so that in this moment, the practice that he had actually led to his performance. So what we want to say as disciples is that the practices don't lead to our performance, but the practices of getting into Scripture, having these things in your life, leads to His presence. And so what we looked at this past weekend was 3 big ideas: anthropology, theology, doxology. So anthropology, what does it mean to be a human? Theology, how do we think about God and how does God inform this area? And doxology, this idea of worship. So anthropology, what does it mean to be a human being? Literally, what the baseline is, that what it means to be a human being is that you are a worshiper. This is our wiring as worshipers. You see, worship is at the heart of discipleship because it's all about who and what we love ultimately. So at the core of what we love is our identity, our allegiances, the ways that we form our life. We give ourselves to the things in our life that we love ultimately. So to be a human means that we need love, meaning, satisfaction, and that we're all giving up of ourselves to these things in our lives. And so we are all worshipers, whether you are a irreligious person or religious person. At the heart of what it means to be a human is that we are worshiping, we are loving things actively. And so I used a quote from David Foster Wallace in the sermon, his commencement speech at Kenyon College. Foster Wallace is not a Christian at all, but here's what he says: in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice is what we get to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. And so at the heart of this idea of practicing is this idea of worshiping, which you and I, all humans, are actively worshiping something. So this is what it means to be a human being. So therefore, you can see your life, if you want to break up the different parts of your life, as liturgies or practices in which you are actively worship something with the habits in your life. They all direct what we love, these practices in our life. And so, for example, we live in a very consumeristic culture. How do you become a consumerist or buy into this ideology of consumerism? Nobody comes to us with a sword and with a ransom note to say you have to become a consumerist or buy into this idea of consumerism. That's not how it happens. How do you buy into it? You just slowly practice consumerism and find your loves there. So constant trips to the mall, buying things on Amazon, all of these things, these are liturgies. These are practices in your life that form and shape what you love and how you love. So this is the idea of what does it mean to be a human being? You, I are all worshipers, which leads to this idea of theology. I started off by talking about our cultural moment. Where are we? And by doing that, I mirrored the story of the Old Testament people of God in Israel and their exile to Babylon. So long story short, God's people in the south, Judah, gets taken into exile by King Nebuchadnezzar. Think about them being exiled to a place like New York. Babylon, this place that they were exiled to, was a flourishing superpower. And so this is where the people of God were. What Nebuchadnezzar did is he didn't want to persecute the Jews. He actually wanted to assimilate them to their gods. And so we live in a very similar time. We are living in exile where our views are not the majority views anymore. The good old days of the past where the Christian ideas, the Judeo-Christian values that were in our culture, they're no longer here. We are living in a new time. We are exiles in a new center, in a new city of Babylon. And this is our culture. So the question is, how do we flourish as the minority now as the people of God? How do we solidify our identity as God's people living in this time? And I believe the way forward is practicing the faith. We practice the faith. And so we get this idea from a few different places in Scripture. The first would be 1 Timothy 4:8, where Paul says, actually starting in verse 7, have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Listen what he says. Rather, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise both for the present life and the life to come. This idea of training, of practicing, like somebody who's training for a race practices and trains, so do we in this life of discipleship. That's one of them. The other place is in Philippians 1:6. Philippians 1:6, a famous verse. It says, being confident of this, he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Jesus. And so there's this idea of grace that God is going to bring to completion what he has started in me. And then the next chapter in Philippians 2:12, Paul says this, therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my absence, but now much more in my presence, but not much more in my absence, he says, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And so you have this tension that God's going to complete the work in it. And then Paul also says, work out your salvation. This idea of training, of practicing our faith. So here's the difference. The difference is between a motorboat, a raft, and a sailboat. A motorboat, I'm in charge, the speed, the direction, all set by me. And this is how some people see the practices or the disciplines, is that it's all about me. And if I do this, then I grow. Other people see the practices or the spiritual disciplines as a raft. People say, I'm into grace. And the raft just kind of goes where it wants to. If you ask them to do anything to work out their salvation, they say, no, I'm into grace, not works. But the thing is that we're not called to be passive. So we're not a motorboat where we're in charge, and we're not a raft where we just kind of drift aimlessly. Instead, discipleship to Jesus is like a sailboat. It's about the wind. I can't control the wind. I don't manufacture the wind, but there is a part for me to play. The question is, where is the wind blowing? And then to put up the sail so that I go in that direction. See, the spiritual disciplines, the practices are like the disciplines. It's sailing in real time. So this leads us to doxology. How do we worship God now in this time? It's through the practices. It's through the disciplines. So many different practices. You've probably heard of them. There's practices of abstinence. You give up things. So solitude, silence, fasting, frugality, even sacrifice. There's disciplines of engagement, study, worship, celebration, service, prayer, fellowship, confessions, things that we give up and things that we engage in, so that these are tools in which that we can experience God's presence in our life. And we believe that these habits, these actions, these practices form us into followers of Jesus. They tell us a different story of what is good, true, right, and beautiful. This is the power of habit. So we willingly embrace repetition as good in all kinds of different sectors of our life. If you're a golfer, we go to the driving range to make sure that our swing is right, so that when we actually go to play golf, it works. For those of us who have done musical training and instruments, we know that practicing matters before the game. So we know that intuitively, but we don't actually always apply that to our faith, which is what's very important. So one thinker says, if the sovereign Lord has created us as creatures of habit, why should we think repetition is bad for our spiritual growth? These are the practices, the repetition of doing this together. So what happens as we start to do this is we encounter his presence. David Mathis in his book says, the means of grace or the disciplines are not about earning God's favor. So let's not think that this is about earning God's favor. It's not about twisting his arm or controlling his blessing. He says, but it's readying ourselves for consistent saturation in the role of his tides. It's placing us in a place where he can meet us as we engage in these practices. So there's a famous painting at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, and it is of Jesus holding a lamp, and he's at a door. On this door, there is no door handle. In other words, it can only be opened by the person inside. And Jesus is knocking on the door. I believe that's what he's doing with us, with this, in our culture. He is wanting to be with us. He is readying himself to be with us. The question is, will we place ourselves to be with him through the practices, through the disciplines? So, great opportunity for you now to discuss, what does this look like? What practices do you have in your life? This isn't about earning God's favor, it's about enjoying his presence. So good for you as you now talk, discuss, pray, practice the faith together in your life group. Thanks for tuning in.